Welcome to The Blue Space, Standard Bank, also trading as Stanbic Bank's thought leadership platform, where we seek to engage industry players and stakeholders on topical matters within the economies within which we all operate in. Of course, this becomes relevant in that as we provide financing solutions, we do that on an informed basis. Today's Blue Space conversation centers on Kenya and East Africa, focusing on energy and infrastructure development and finance. My name is Mphokolo Magara. Often what we see when it comes to the need for developing infrastructure and energy is regulated markets within the context of African economies. So Neala, I'll start with you. How does the PPP Directorate facilitate that to come to the fore?
There is a robust institutional framework. That's what facilitates the projects to come into place. We have the PPP Act of 2021. First of all, there are institutions which are established under the Act. We have a board, which is called the PPP Committee, as an institutional framework for approving feasibility studies, negotiation reports, key pillars of the whole process. They stand there as gatekeepers to ensure that the approval process flows. The Directorate itself is an institution because the proposals do come to the Directorate from the contracting authorities, and that's the first port of call. So we develop the proposals together. And so the Directorate is a nexus in between the private sector and the contracting authorities to move the projects forward and take them for approval. We do have the contracting authority, that's another institution. And within the Act, it has procedures as to how the contracting authority can bring forth the projects. There is also the petitions committee in case there are any appeals. And of course, just tying everything round, the whole framework of the Act recognizes the SPV structure so that at the end of the day, you have the project finance structure within the whole infrastructure space.
Kenya does have a fairly robust, PPP framework that's quite clear. That's actually been a template for other markets in the region. The institutional framework makes sense and gives comfort to the investors. PPPs are inevitably going to be a very important way in which the government procures new infrastructure, fiscal constraints and other things notwithstanding.
Engineer Mwangi, what is the long-term energy plan for Kenya? What does the market look like? Is there commercial viability? A lot of that goes into how would make up a master plan.
This country is fortunate to have different master plans. And master plans are excellent tools because it allows the investor to see this big picture. And that master plan even goes further to look at other aspects of whether it is legal, regulatory framework. What is it that needs to be done to unlock this potential that a country has? And to me, it goes on further to also look at how can local players participate.
You need to take a holistic view of the master plans, both from the least cost power development plan in terms of which articulates a generation and distribution view, a transmission view, a demand view. We're seeing the global demand for computing power driven by AI, of which markets such as Kenya with green energy or green energy potential will also be beneficiaries. Currently, our master plans don't bake in any of that demand.
The gap in transmission infrastructure of around $3 billion. In the context of Kenya, that's roughly just shy of 3% of GDP, rounding roughly. Quite a big number if you look at transmission as a component of energy systems. Kaniaru Africa 50 has walked this journey in Kenya, has walked this journey across the continent, mainly in transmission lines. Can you just share your experience as to how that journey has been?
For Africa 50, going back to what Neala said, what we have looked at across different markets, Kenya including, is looking at what the scope and support for PPP investments generally is. And in our case, one of the areas we thought was ripe for PPP investments in Kenya was the transmission sector. So transmission has historically been hugely underfunded. When we have looked at the transmission system master plans that are put out by KETRACO and the regulator, there is at least a funding gap of about $3 billion in the next 4 years in terms of the capital required to procure new projects. In addition to that, we do recognize the fiscal space governments, including their state-owned enterprises, also have. And we also recognize the criticality of transmission in unlocking, whether it's renewables generation, new sources of power demand, expanding electricity access. So from our perspective, we've seen this as a sector that has very strong investable merits from a private sector perspective.
Now, Carol, you have the likes of yourselves as Schneider, who are solution providers, who caught in the middle in the sense that you've got regulators, you've got engineers who look at feasibility, you've got investors like Africa 50 who are making decisions in real time. But as a solution provider like Schneider, who's got access to technology, who's got access to clients who give you feedback loops in terms of what developments they're seeing in their respective industrial sectors, but also what is driving their investment decisions. How does this all come together in terms of what solutions you propose to clients today, given how long it might take to develop the right solution, cognizant of the fact that as we sit today, technology is rapidly evolving. But also, if you don't make the investment decision today, returns could erode, returns could increase, but it's about you crystallizing the opportunity today.
So the way we look at the market is really solving for today, based on the technologies and how customers want the solutions. One of the biggest observations we're seeing, especially in the Kenyan energy space, is it's not really the emergence, it's actually maturing now of what we call self-generation, commercial and industrial segment. And I think it's probably the fastest growing, and I'm really curious to know whether this is part of the energy master plan, because I think it's moving at a pace that is definitely going to be necessary to incorporate in the plan. I think today data varies between the self-generation ranging to about 10% of the installed capacity in the country today. And it's where we see a lot of activity. So it seems like a number of industry players are taking matters in their hands. And most of these decisions are actually driven by cost, and they're looking at how do I make my process efficient. And the biggest contributor for many of the industries that we see is obviously an energy cost. And because of that, the ecosystem has developed quite rapidly. And now you find small, I wouldn't call them small, but emerging, I would say, mini utilities who are offering energy as a service. So they're coming to you, your load could be, let's say, 5 megawatts, and they're saying, hey, I'll use your rooftop, I will install the 5 megawatts, I'll charge you at a discount from what you're getting from the utility today. So if KPLC is charging you 20 shillings to the kilowatt hour, I'll give you a 25% discount. So I'll charge you at 15. You don't need to invest anything. Just give me your rooftop space and I'll build you. And this model is really being taken up, and it's different sizes depending on the loads and the customer profiles. And for me, this is actually a great, we see it as a great opportunity for our business, because then we are able to push our solutions through. But if I look at it from a country perspective and the future of the utility, then it brings complexity that requires really looking at how do you then incorporate all these mini generation facilities that are obviously, most of them are solar-based and therefore not necessarily baseload. But over time, today, of course, the regulation is not allowing those people to feed into the grid, but I'm sure, regulations are dynamic, and down the road, this could happen. Then how do you manage such a grid that's very dynamic with so many renewable energy sources? So we see ourselves then as a solution provider and see how this dynamic is evolving and how we then need to build solutions to help utilities solve some of these upcoming challenges.
So irrespective of what sector you're in, energy costs are quite significant in that they'll make up 30% of your OPEX line.
The cost of energy is already at the table.
Yes.
And it is occupying a big space on the table, especially for private sector, and especially those whose input costs, as you mentioned, are high. The manufacturers, name it, people have a complex system. We have these data centers that consume a lot of power.
I think we cannot talk about energy without talking about losses. And because one of the bigger factor of our cost of energy today is the transmission and distribution losses. How do we address those so that then energy cost is comparable to the alternative?
And it's very interesting because, in fact, we've seen the emergence in Kenya specifically of the energy open access regulations, that piece of legislation is actually out for public participation.
I have looked at the legislation and it appears to be ahead of its time. But there are these, let's say, the present setup where maybe implementation of some part of this legislation could severely disrupt, the current setup. But one thing is for sure, as long as the person who is consuming this energy has this alternative, as you have mentioned, Carol, they will go for those alternatives.
Maybe I just weigh in with a couple of thoughts on the points that have been raised, a lot of which I agree with. First of all, I think you're going to have many models in the sector, both from a generation, distribution, and transmission perspective. And within that, we are going to see, lots of, in my view, very many different business models in the power sector. And again, we don't even need to look that far to see how this has played out in other markets. Mm-hmm. So India, to me, is an instructive example. India began the process of effectively deregulating its power sector in the early 2000s. So moving from, a single buyer model to a multi-buyer model, moving from a single transmission service provider to a multi-transmission provider. And in that whole context, again, going from, one single transmission, private transmission player to over 75 different transmission players today. Moving from one single buyer in the system to a multi-buyer framework in the system. Moving from zero captive generation. India today has 420 gigawatts of installed power. About maybe 60 gigawatts of that is captive generation. But I do think there are still significant potential upsides for a lot of people in the system. But again, some of the key precepts will have to be in place. Cost is an important one. Yep. Efficiency is a very important one. Yep. You saw in the Indian system, for example, the fact that you had multiple providers of transmission services, then the availability and efficiency of those lines improved because that was the basis of the revenue construct for which private parties were being paid for providing those services. And there was an existence of alternatives, right? Mm-hmm. I still think you're going to have a very central role for the established utilities, whether it's one or other distribution utilities, because we've seen this even in the US markets, even in places where you have very high degrees of self-generation, like California, for example, the utility there has to be the provider of last resort, because when your system goes down, you want to be able to access the grid backup. So
I'll maybe just allow each one of us 30 seconds, just as a parting shot.
African countries have the responsibility to make this even more conducive, to allow this infrastructure to be done, and in so doing, uplift the standard of living of the people of this continent.
There's more need to really look at how do we become efficient in the way we distribute, but also in the way we use it, so that we ensure, we pay for the true cost of energy and not for the inefficiencies in the system.
As China and India deploy so much more batteries and storage and other technologies, the cost of those technologies is also coming down, which I think will play into one of our big issues, which is broader affordability. So I think the trend is our friend.
There's a lot of opportunity for the private sector to invest in PPPs. And that's why even when we are supposed to send one party to the contracting authorities to help with the project, we send 3 or 4. I just end with the adage from Henry Ford. When we work together, success will necessarily follow.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time and for the insightful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Most welcome. Thank you.